April 1st, 1945. The morning breaks over the emerald hills of Okinawa with a silence so complete it feels unnatural. The air hangs heavy with salt and smoke, carrying the distant rumble of naval guns like thunder trapped beneath the earth. In the shadow of a limestone cave near the village of Shuri, an elderly woman clutches a small wooden Buddha to her chest, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Beside her, 3 children press themselves against the cold stone, their eyes wide and unblinking. They have not eaten in 2 days. They have not slept in 4. And now, they hear the sound they have been dreading since the Americans landed on the beaches, the crunch of boots on coral gravel, the metallic clink of equipment, the low voices speaking a language that sounds like the growl of demons. This is the sound of liberation. But to these people, huddled in darkness, it is the sound of annihilation. For 3.5 years, the Empire of Japan had prepared its people for this moment. Not through hope, but through terror. Not through truth, but through myth. The Japanese civilian population had been fed a steady diet of propaganda so toxic, so complete, that by the spring of 1945, the very sight of an American soldier represented something far worse than death. They had been told that the Americans were savages, barbarians who raped without mercy, who tortured children for sport, who desecrated the bodies of the dead and drank the blood of the innocent. They had been told that capture meant humiliation beyond endurance, that surrender was not merely cowardice but a betrayal of the emperor, the ancestors, and the divine spirit of the Yamato race itself. And so, across the islands of the Pacific, from Saipan to Tinian, from Guam to Iwo Jima, and now here on Okinawa, Japanese civilians chose death. Mothers threw their babies from cliffs before leaping after them. Families detonated grenades in their own shelters. Old men and women waded into the sea with stones tied to their waists. The Americans, advancing through burned villages and blood-soaked caves, found entire communities erased, not by bullets, but by belief. But something else happened too. Something the propaganda had not accounted for. Something that would unravel, thread by thread, the mythology that had held an entire nation in its grip. It began with a gesture as simple as removing a helmet. To understand the terror that gripped the Japanese civilians in the spring of 1945, one must first understand the architecture of fear that had been constructed in their minds. It was not built overnight. It was not the product of a single speech or a single poster. It was the culmination of a decade-long campaign of ideological conditioning, rooted in the Bushido Code, amplified by militarism, and weaponized by a government that knew it was losing the war. From the moment Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the narrative of racial superiority had been woven into the fabric of daily life. The Japanese people were told they were the chosen race, descended from the gods, destined to rule Asia under the benevolent guidance of the emperor. The Westerners, particularly the Americans, were depicted as corrupt, materialistic, and spiritually bankrupt. They were the Oni, the demons of folklore, come to defile the sacred homeland. But as the war turned against Japan, the propaganda shifted. It became darker, more desperate. By 1944, with American forces island-hopping across the Pacific, the Japanese government knew that invasion of the home islands was inevitable. And so they began to prepare the population not for victory, but for sacrifice. The Ministry of Education distributed pamphlets to schools with titles like The Way of the Subject and Instructions for the Decisive Battle. These documents did not speak of military strategy or defense. They spoke of death. Glorious, honorable, necessary death. One pamphlet, distributed to civilians on Okinawa in early 1945, read, "The enemy is a beast in human form. He has no concept of honor or mercy. If you are captured, the men will be tortured and killed. The women will be violated and displayed as trophies. The children will be taken and raised as slaves to mock the emperor. There is no shame in death. There is only shame in surrender." This was not hyperbole. This was policy. The Japanese military had studied the rape of Nanking, the brutality in the Philippines, the atrocities committed by their own forces across China and Southeast Asia. And in a projection of their own darkness, they convinced their people that the Americans would do the same. Worse, perhaps, because the Americans were not bound by the code of Bushido. They were animals. And so, when the first American Marines waded ashore on Okinawa on April 1, 1945, Easter Sunday, in a coincidence lost on no one, they were met not with resistance from the civilians, but with absence. The villages were empty. The fields abandoned. The people had vanished into the caves, into the hills, into the tombs of their ancestors. They were waiting to die. The Marines who landed on Okinawa that spring were not the same men who had stormed Guadalcanal 3 years earlier. They were harder, wearier, more efficient in the mechanics of killing. They had seen the kamikazes at Leyte Gulf, the banzai charges at Peleliu, the flamethrowers on Iwo Jima. They had learned that this enemy did not surrender. That every cave had to be cleared, every bunker burned, every shadow investigated. They had learned to trust nothing. But they had not learned to expect what they found in the villages of southern Okinawa. Corporal James McAllister, a rifleman with the 1st Marine Division, later wrote in his diary, "We moved through a village called Kakazu. Every house was empty. Every door open. We found a well, and at the bottom we found bodies. Women and children. Maybe a dozen. They had jumped in together. I have seen men die in every way you can imagine. I have seen them blown apart, burned alive, drowned in mud. But I have never seen anything like this. They were more afraid of us than they were of death." This was the pattern that repeated itself across the island. In the village of Kuba, Marines found a schoolhouse where 32 children had been killed by their own teacher, who then took his own life. In the town of Shuri, an entire family was discovered in a cellar, dead from a grenade blast, the father's hand still gripping the pin. Near the cliffs of Mabuni, soldiers found the bodies of more than 1,000 civilians who had leaped into the sea rather than face capture. The Americans were horrified. They had been trained to fight soldiers, not to prevent mass suicide. They had been told that the Japanese were fanatical, that they would fight to the last man. But no one had prepared them for this. For mothers killing their own children. For grandmothers choosing cliffs over compassion. And yet, the orders from command were clear. Save as many civilians as possible. Treat them with respect. Show them that the propaganda is a lie. Easier said than done. The first encounters between American soldiers and Japanese civilians were fraught with misunderstanding, fear, and heartbreak. The language barrier was absolute. The cultural chasm even wider. The Americans called out in broken Japanese, promising food, promising safety. The civilians responded with silence, or with screams, or with death. But slowly, painfully, something began to change. It started with the medics. The Navy corpsmen and Army medics attached to the infantry units were often the first to make contact with wounded or terrified civilians. They carried no weapons, only their kits. They wore red crosses on their helmets and armbands. And when they approached a crying child or an injured woman, they did something the propaganda had said was impossible. They knelt down. They removed their helmets. They smiled. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, a Marine mortarman who would later write one of the most harrowing memoirs of the Pacific War, described one such encounter near the village of Wana. "We found an old woman hiding in a tomb. She was shaking so badly I thought she was having a seizure. Our corpsman went up to her slowly, hands out, no weapon. He took off his helmet and set it on the ground. Then he took out a chocolate bar and held it out to her. She stared at him like he was a ghost, like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. And then she took it. and she started to cry. The helmet. That simple act, removing the helmet, became a symbol of humanity. The steel pot, the M1 helmet, was the face of the American soldier. It was impersonal, intimidating, mechanical. But beneath it was a face. A young face, often. A tired face. A face that smiled, that frowned, that showed emotion. A human face. And that changed everything. The American military command, recognizing the crisis unfolding on Okinawa, began to deploy psychological operations teams to the front lines. These units included Japanese-American soldiers from the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and the Military Intelligence Service, many of whom had been born in Japan or had parents who spoke the language fluently. They were equipped with loudspeakers, leaflets, and instructions to do whatever it took to convince the civilians that surrender was not death. One such soldier was Sergeant Roy Matsumoto, a Nisei interpreter who had fought with Merrill's marauders in Burma before being transferred to the Pacific. Matsumoto later recalled, "The hardest part was not the language. I could speak to them. The hardest part was convincing them that I was real, that I was Japanese, but also American, that those two things could exist in the same person." They had been told that any Japanese who cooperated with the Americans were traitors, that we had abandoned our ancestors, our emperor, our souls. But when they saw me, when they heard me speak in their own dialect, when they saw me standing next to these American soldiers who treated me as an equal, it broke something in their minds. The propaganda had no answer for me. The psychological operations teams used every tool at their disposal. They broadcasted messages over loudspeakers, urging civilians to come out of hiding. They dropped leaflets illustrated with photographs of Japanese prisoners being treated well, eating meals, receiving medical care. They brought forward captured Japanese soldiers who had not been tortured, who had not been mutilated, who stood alive and well as proof that surrender did not mean annihilation. But the most effective tool was simpler than any of that. It was food. The chocolate bar. The K-ration. The can of Spam. These became the symbols of American abundance in the eyes of the Japanese civilians. Because by the spring of 1945, the people of Okinawa were starving. The Japanese military had requisitioned every scrap of food on the island for the defense effort. Rice paddies had been abandoned. Livestock slaughtered or driven into the hills. Fishing boats destroyed to prevent their use by the Americans. The civilians had been reduced to eating weeds, roots, and whatever insects they could find. Children had distended bellies from malnutrition. The elderly were dying in silence. And then the Americans arrived, and they had food. Not just enough to survive. Food to waste. Food to give away. Food in quantities that seemed impossible, miraculous, obscene. Corporal Richard Whitaker, an Army infantryman with the 96th Division, wrote in a letter home, "We handed out rations to a group of refugees near Yanabaru. Maybe 50 people, all of them skin and bones. We gave them crackers, canned fruit, chocolate. One little girl, maybe 6 years old, ate an entire can of peaches by herself, syrup and all. Then she threw up. Then she asked for more. I realized then that these people had no idea what America was. They thought we were monsters. But monsters don't have canned peaches." The food was more than sustenance. It was proof. Proof that the propaganda was a lie. Proof that the Americans were not demons, but men. Men with so much that they could afford to give it away. Men who would share with strangers, with enemies, with people who had been trying to kill them just days before. This was a concept utterly alien to the Japanese military culture, which had reduced its own soldiers to cannibalism on islands like New Guinea and Guadalcanal. The Japanese army did not have the logistics to feed its own troops, let alone its civilians. But the Americans did. And that abundance, that casual, wasteful, generous abundance, was perhaps the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal. As the weeks passed and the battle for Okinawa ground on, the encounters between American soldiers and Japanese civilians became more frequent, more complex, and more human. The Americans learned to approach with hands open, helmets off, food extended. The civilians learned that cooperation did not mean betrayal, that survival was not cowardice, that the emperor would not strike them down from heaven for accepting a can of beans from a Marine. Civilian refugee camps were established behind the American lines, administered by military government teams and staffed by medics, chaplains, and translators. By the end of May 1945, these camps held more than 150,000 Japanese civilians, nearly half the pre-war population of Okinawa. They were fed, clothed, and given medical care. They were shown films, taught English, and allowed to send letters to family members in other camps. They were treated, in short, as human beings. And the transformation was astonishing. Major John McCormick, a military government officer assigned to a camp near Ishikawa, wrote in his official report, "Within 2 weeks of arrival, the civilians' attitude changed completely. The fear was replaced by curiosity, the hostility by cooperation. Children who had hidden behind their mothers now ran up to soldiers asking for candy. Old men who had refused to speak began teaching us Japanese words. Women who had tried to kill themselves with broken glass were now working as nurses in the camp hospital. It was as if they had woken from a nightmare and realized it was all a lie. But the nightmare was not over for everyone. Even as some civilians embraced the reality of American occupation, others remained trapped in the ideology that had defined their entire lives. Thousands still hid in the caves, still refused to surrender, still chose death over dishonor. The battle for Okinawa would rage until June 21, 1945, making it the longest and bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War. More than 12,000 Americans would die. More than 100,000 Japanese soldiers would be killed. And an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians would perish, many by their own hands or the hands of Japanese soldiers who forced them to commit suicide rather than allow them to surrender. The tragedy was compounded by the knowledge that it did not have to be this way, that the fear, the terror, the mass death could have been prevented if only the civilians had known the truth. If only they had been allowed to see that the Americans, for all their faults and flaws, were not the demons they had been told about. One incident, more than any other, crystallized the conflict between propaganda and reality in the minds of both Americans and Japanese. It took place in early June, near the town of Mabuni, where the Japanese 32nd Army had made its final stand. A group of Marines from the 6th Division was clearing caves along the southern cliffs when they heard a sound that stopped them cold, a baby crying. Lance Corporal David Kowalski later described what happened next. "We thought it was a trap. The Japs had used recordings before, sounds of women screaming or babies crying, to lure us into ambushes. But this was different. This was real. So we called for our interpreter, a Nisei guy named Takahashi. He went up to the cave entrance and started talking. Soft, like he was talking to his own mother. He told them the war was over, that the Americans would not hurt them, that they could come out and live. Nothing happened for maybe 10 minutes. Then we saw movement. A woman crawled out, holding a baby. She was maybe 20 years old, covered in dirt and blood. The baby was naked, screaming. She looked at us and started to shake. She thought we were going to kill her. So Takahashi took off his helmet. Then I took off mine. Then all of us did. We set down our rifles. We just stood there, these dirty, exhausted Marines, helmets in our hands, waiting. And slowly, she stood up. She walked toward us. And when she got close enough, she fell to her knees and started bowing over and over, thanking us in Japanese. Takahashi started crying. Hell, half of us started crying. We gave her water, gave her food, wrapped the baby in a poncho. And I remember thinking, how many others are still in those caves, too afraid to come out? How many died because they believed the lie? The answer, tragically, was thousands. The end of the battle for Okinawa marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War. The island became a staging ground for the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, which was projected to result in millions of casualties on both sides. But it also became a laboratory for the American occupation strategy that would eventually be implemented across all of Japan after the atomic bombs and the Emperor's surrender in August. The lessons learned on Okinawa, about propaganda, about fear, about the power of simple human gestures, would shape the entire post-war relationship between America and Japan. General Douglas MacArthur, who would become the supreme commander of the Allied powers in Japan, took careful note of the reports from Okinawa. He understood that the Japanese people had been indoctrinated, not merely defeated. That they would need to be re-educated, not punished. That the occupation would have to be firm but fair, authoritative but compassionate. And so, when American troops landed in Japan proper in September 1945, they came prepared. They brought food, mountains of it. They brought medical supplies, blankets, construction materials. They brought military government teams trained in Japanese culture and language. And they brought orders to treat the civilian population with respect, to show by example that democracy and abundance were not incompatible, that freedom did not mean chaos, that the Americans were not conquerors but liberators. The Japanese people, who had been told to expect rape, torture, and enslavement, instead found soldiers who handed out chocolate bars to children, who helped rebuild schools and hospitals, who allowed the emperor to remain on the throne, preserving the continuity of Japanese identity even as the militarist ideology was dismantled, who took off their helmets and showed their faces. The transformation was not immediate, and it was not universal. There were incidents of violence, of exploitation, of cultural misunderstanding. The occupation was far from perfect. But compared to what the propaganda had promised, compared to what the Japanese military had convinced its people was inevitable, the reality of American occupation was a revelation. In the decades after the war, many Japanese civilians who survived Okinawa or who lived through the occupation would look back on that moment of first contact, the moment when an American soldier removed his helmet, as the instant when the mythology shattered, when the demon became a man, when the ideology of racial hatred gave way to the simple recognition of shared humanity. One such survivor was Fumiko Nakamoto, who was 12 years old when the battle for Okinawa began. In an interview conducted in 1985, she recalled, "I was hiding with my grandmother in a cave near Naha. We had a grenade. My grandmother said that when the Americans came, she would pull the pin and we would die together. She said it would be quick, that we would not feel pain, that we would be with our ancestors. I believed her. I was ready to die. But then we heard voices, Japanese voices, telling us to come out, telling us we would be safe. My grandmother said it was a trick, that the Americans were using recordings. But I was curious. I crawled to the entrance of the cave and looked out, and I saw them. American soldiers. Big, tall, with strange faces. But they were smiling. And one of them, a young man with red hair, took off his helmet and waved at me. He held up a can of something. Food, I thought. My stomach hurt so much from hunger. So I stood up. My grandmother tried to pull me back, but I walked out. The red-haired soldier gave me the can. It was pineapple. I had never tasted pineapple before. It was the sweetest thing I had ever eaten. and I realized that my grandmother was wrong. The Americans were not demons. They were just men. Men with pineapple. Fumiko Nakamoto would go on to work as a translator for the American Occupation Forces, later attending university in California, and eventually becoming a professor of Japanese-American relations. She dedicated her life to ensuring that the lies of the past would not poison the future. That the lesson of that pineapple can, the lesson that fear thrives on ignorance, and that knowledge is the antidote to hatred, would not be forgotten. The helmet became a symbol, but it was never just about the helmet. It was about what the helmet represented. The barrier between us and them, between human and demon, between truth and propaganda. When the American soldiers removed their helmets, they removed that barrier. They showed their faces, their vulnerability, their humanity. And in doing so, they offered the Japanese civilians a choice that their own government had denied them. The choice to see for themselves, to judge for themselves, to decide for themselves whether the Americans were monsters or men. Most chose to see the truth. And that choice saved lives. Not just in the immediate sense, though it certainly did that, as thousands of civilians emerged from caves and surrendered to American forces rather than committing suicide, but in the broader, deeper sense of saving a nation from the cycle of hatred and revenge that had consumed so much of the 20th century. The occupation of Japan, for all its flaws, was one of the most successful exercises in post-war reconstruction in modern history. Japan transformed from a militaristic empire into a pacifist democracy, from an enemy into an ally, from a culture of death worship into a society that valued life and prosperity. And much of that transformation can be traced back to those first moments of contact, when American soldiers showed that the propaganda was a lie, when they demonstrated through action that a different kind of relationship was possible. The chocolate bar, the can of peaches, the pineapple, these became the symbols of American abundance, yes, but also of American generosity. They represented a nation that had so much that it could afford to share, a nation that believed in the possibility of redemption, a nation that saw former enemies as future friends. This was not naivety. It was not weakness. It was a conscious strategic choice, rooted in the belief that democracy and prosperity were the most powerful weapons against totalitarianism and despair. And it worked. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan was on the path to becoming the economic powerhouse it would be by the 1980s. The U.S.-Japan alliance, forged in the ashes of Okinawa and Hiroshima, would become one of the cornerstones of the post-war international order. And the Japanese people, who had once been taught to fear and hate the Americans, would come to admire and emulate them. But the lesson of Okinawa is not just a lesson about Japan. It is a lesson about the power of propaganda, about the danger of ideological indoctrination, about the human cost of lies told by governments to their own people. It is a lesson about how fear can be manufactured, how hatred can be cultivated, and how entire populations can be driven to madness and death by the cynical manipulation of their leaders. The Japanese civilians who killed themselves and their children on Okinawa were not cowards. They were not evil. They were victims, victims of a totalitarian state that had poisoned their minds with fear, that had convinced them that death was preferable to life under the enemy, that had stolen from them the most basic human right, the right to hope. And the American soldiers who landed on those beaches, who cleared those caves, who removed their helmets and offered food and compassion, they were not saints. They were not perfect. Many of them held their own prejudices, their own hatreds. They had seen friends die, had been hardened by years of brutal combat. But they chose, in those moments, to be human, to show mercy when they could have shown cruelty, to offer life when they could have delivered death. That choice matters. It mattered then, and it matters now. In the spring of 1946, a year after the battle for Okinawa ended, a memorial was erected near the cliffs of Mabuni, where so many civilians had leaped to their deaths. It was a simple stone marker, inscribed with the names of the known dead and a prayer for those whose names had been lost. American soldiers, Japanese civilians, and Okinawan survivors gathered for the dedication ceremony. A Buddhist monk offered prayers. A Christian chaplain read from the Bible. And a Marine lieutenant, who had fought through the entire campaign, laid a wreath at the base of the stone. In his speech, translated by a Nisei interpreter, the lieutenant said, "We came to this island as enemies. We left as something else. Not quite friends, not yet. But no longer enemies. We learned here that the line between human and monster is thinner than we thought. That it can be crossed with a gesture, with a word, with an act of kindness. We learned that the people we were taught to hate were just people. Afraid, hungry, desperate people who had been lied to by their leaders and abandoned by their gods. We could not save them all. We could not stop the tragedy that unfolded here. But we could bear witness. We could remember. And we could promise that we would do better. That we would choose humanity over hatred, compassion over cruelty, truth over propaganda. That we would take off our helmets and show our faces, always." The stone still stands today, weathered by decades of salt wind and rain. Tourists visit it, many of them Japanese, many of them American, many of them too young to remember the war. They take photographs. They read the inscriptions. They lay flowers at its base. And if they listen carefully, they can still hear the echoes of that long-ago battle, the sound of boots on coral, the cry of a baby in a cave, the metallic clink of a helmet being set on the ground. It is the sound of a choice being made, the choice to be human, even in the midst of inhumanity, the choice to believe in redemption, even after unspeakable horror, the choice to see the face beneath the helmet, and to recognize it as a reflection of our own. That is the legacy of Okinawa. That is the lesson that those American soldiers and those Japanese civilians and those Okinawan survivors taught the world. It is a lesson written in blood and tears and chocolate bars and canned peaches. It is a lesson that cost 250,000 lives to learn. We forget it at our peril. Because in the end, the helmet is just a helmet. The chocolate bar is just a chocolate bar. The propaganda is just words on paper, lies spoken by men who will never face the consequences of those lies. What matters is the choice. The choice to believe or to question. The choice to hate or to understand. The choice to hide in a cave waiting for death, or to walk into the sunlight and accept the hand of a stranger. The Japanese civilians on Okinawa were terrified until the American soldiers removed their helmets. And in that moment of revelation, when the demon became a man, when the lie was exposed for what it was, the world changed. Not all at once. Not completely. But enough. Enough to matter. Enough to save lives. Enough to plant the seeds of a peace that would last generations. That is the power of a simple gesture. That is the power of truth over lies, of humanity over ideology, of hope over despair. That is the story of Okinawa. And it is a story we must never forget. Fade to black. In the silence, the distant sound of waves against limestone cliffs. A child's laughter. The clink of a helmet being set down. And then, nothing but the wind, carrying the memory forward into the future, where it waits to be remembered, to be learned, to be lived again by those who come after.